Cool. So I think one thing that we're interested in exploring too is that. Oh, yeah, Cristiano. Sorry, I thought in the madness, I didn't know you didn't introduce yourself. So go for it, please. Apologies.
I'm Cristiano, not a moderator. Apparently, I'm not good at that. I work at Intel. I'm in games and graphics. I'm a games and graphics engineer. Me and my team have been mainly working on VR the past few years. More from the technical side as well. We've been trying to leverage hardware to create more immersive experiences. So games like The Unspoken or Star Trek Bridge Crew, Arizona Sunshine, and Warhammer Vermintide were all games that we worked on. They have like a CPU switch setting where you could go from low to high and basically make all these cloth sims and environmental effects, extra features, stuff that distracts the eye and makes a more immersive experience that helps you forget that you're in a virtual land and make it more real to you. So that's the main thing we've been working on, and we do a lot of developer outreach. Outside of that, I take part in a lot of the game jams around here and try and do proof of concepts and still help chart some of the uncharted territory in VR. They're mostly been proof of terrible concepts so far, but if I take the Edison approach, I'll just find 500 ways it doesn't work and then maybe stumble upon one day.
At least they aren't terrible proofs of good concepts. So one thing that we're talking about a lot right now is we're talking about our past and how we kind of got into this. And so it sounds like there's a lot of kind of like everybody has a dream around what this should look like. Can I get a couple of people commenting on like what you wanted to look, what you wanted to look at human behavior in VR and kind of like see? Yeah, more your desires than what's actually happening or what needs to happen.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this. So I think that if you think about something like non-conscious bias, if you think about the beliefs that people tend to carry with themselves about like, what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be white? What does it mean to be lower class? What does it mean to be upper class? Like we all bring those beliefs with us everywhere that we go. And we use a lot of visual markers to signal to other people, like, this is what class I am, this is what gender is. And like the thing about VR is that you don't actually have to like make any of those markers. Like you can choose to have avatars that carry those markers or don't, or you could actually choose to like not have an avatar at all. Like that would also be a powerful statement. Like, has anybody here like used Anyland before? One? Okay, everyone needs to download Anyland immediately. It's like $12, so it's completely worth it, and it's really bizarre because it's a social VR experience. But you enter, you have hands, and then your body is represented as like 3 dots, and like that's it. And it's completely up to you to represent, like to figure out how do you work through their AI, their UI, which is the most difficult I've ever seen in my entire life. And so to like really decide exactly how you want to represent yourself. And so they're really, I think it's just made by these 2 random guys in Germany who just like put Anyland up. They have no budget, but the thing is that Anyland is incredibly difficult to use, and the people that figure out how to use it are incredibly dedicated to Anyland and will like have this really, really strong community. And if you listen to, it's like a really recent Voices of VR podcast, Kent Bai, he interviews a super user whose name is Stephanie Mendoza, and Stephanie talks about how like there's all these like, it's like Anyland is so unique in this ecosystem because you have all these like Trump supporters who are like actually like they all actually work together. Like Stephanie is not at all a Trump supporter, and like, she lives in Portland. She's like us, she's super chill. But she said basically like Anyland is so freaking difficult to use that they all like need each other and they rely on each other. And so they've built a community around something else that doesn't have to do with, what is your gender, what is your race, how did you vote? And I think like if that could be like the vision for virtual reality, I think, we could all be better off.
Yeah, any other comments on that?
So I like the idea that we can reinvent kind of. I think the natural thing is to mimic what we know in the physical world, and so one of my most pure social VR experiences was the Northway folks, the people who did Fantastic Contraption. They were experimenting. They wanted to do a load test on this kind of social. They just made a big empty room with some art exhibits, and they just had a bunch of people sign on at the same time to just test it out. But it was real-time streaming audio, your head and hands. Everybody had to be in a Vive or Rift of some sort. And I realized afterwards I acted exactly like how I do, like even today when we broke for lunch. I go get my lunch and I find a corner, and I don't like I'm a high functioning introvert, and I don't put myself in the middle of a bunch of people and bust up their conversation. I actually acted exactly in this virtual space how I do in a real world similar social situation. And so what I'm interested in is if we moved away from uh, the analogs we know, and like things like even the concept of a room, and that people are standing in a circle. If we could do away with some of that to see what's possible, what forms out of that, but then even higher up than that is, could I process the social situation tailored to me? So one of the reasons I would love to hear some of the conversations that happened at lunch today, or find out who some of you are. Is there a way I could have done that that would be comfortable to me, but would have not also affected your experience? So that's the other interesting part about doing all this virtually, and having kind of, it's both social, we're all together, we're sharing an experience, but there is this interesting opportunity to tailor your individual consumption of that experience to whatever suits you. And I have no idea what the implications of that would be, or how that would change how we behave, or but then it also brings up another interesting option of, could I then try to like experience that situation the way Will would experience it, and then be like, oh, that's how he sees and hears things. It's so empathy kind of starts to creep in there. So I would just like the ability to move past, once we get enough people in VR and enough people willing to do these things, I look forward to the ability to experiment beyond what we know out of the real world.
Yeah, and it sounds like to be able to make that kind of stuff happen, we need to look at overcoming issues of technology, but then also social issues of, privacy and harassment. Like, this stuff isn't without challenge. What are some of the challenges that you see more specifically cropping up when trying to think about how people react to one another in VR?
I'll go first. So this is sort of like to expand on what you're talking about, that is part of the problem of VR right now. There is a tendency to just recreate what we already know, right? Like to make a game where you shoot things, or a theater piece where you're watching a stage. Or sometimes, it's like imitating a dark ride from a theme park, so you're like sitting on something that like moves through a space. There is not yet really a solid vocabulary or understanding of the next stage of that. That involves like a lot of the language of the brain, like a lot of understanding of the cognitive interactions that you'll have, and I think Jessica should speak a lot about that. But in that same way, like by making the things that we're making already, we're not understanding how the brain is truly processing stuff, right? There's a lot of ethical design considerations that are not being dealt with right now. One of the main images that we see of people in using VR, for example, is them like batting it away from their face in fear, or like running into stuff because they don't have that field of vision. So like you're starting to self-select people out of wanting to do that. Like even in an escape room, one of the most common questions we get is this scary? So like by showing that it is probably scary, like you're missing a huge part of the audience, then the resulting content that gets made for the remaining audience is just the scary stuff, and so on. Then there's also stuff like utilizing pretty normal game design stuff of getting people hooked into your thing and like playing for hours and hours and hours. It's a very, very different thing when
you can't see daylight or other people or any of the cues that your brain normally needs to understand how time is passing. So things like time dilation are like a serious issue. People talk about like putting the headset on and then, you know, they take it off and it's gone dark. It's like 12 hours later, they haven't stopped to eat, they haven't stopped to rest. And that's because the game is communicating with their brain in the way that like something you're experiencing through a screen is communicating with you. It's just a completely different field. So I hope that that's something that gets resolved.
Just to piggyback on what you said about like how the brain works. So I would say like the lack of risk in VR is also like a significant challenge because the thing is that I think that people are not going to be as engaged like after they get over the initial novelty of it. You know, once you realize that like once you're not going to fall off the cliff, or like the first time that people, like in alt space where you're doing the maze, there's these ladders that you can climb up to like see the other parts of the maze. And the first time that people climb up the ladder, they're just like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna fall down. And they get really, really nervous. But then, you know, the second or third time, they don't care at all. And so I think the thing is like, how do you maintain like people's interest by bringing in an element of risk? I think one area where there is still that risk would be social risk, and that would lead back to the challenge of harassment. There was recently a study done, it was done in Egypt, and they asked men, why do you harass women on the street? And all the Egyptian men said, because it's fun. And so I don't know if you can extrapolate that to VR at all, but like harassment is like a significant problem. I just ran a study with 13 women in social VR. They were in VR for about 30 minutes, and 5 out of the 13 women got harassed in a 30-minute period. And as a result, they told me like, nope, I am not interested in trying VR again. Or if they were willing to go back, it would be in a solo experience. Like they would go back and do Google Earth VR or something. And so I think that it's really going to be important to consider exactly who is the target audience of this experience or game. How do you bring in an element of risk that people are going to care about, so that way they'll like keep coming back. And then how do you give people the opportunity to, like I would just say, how do you make privacy the default? And so if people do want to hang out with other people, maybe that's a capability for them to add friends. But the way that a lot of the existing social VR experiences are set up, it's not, like privacy is not the default. And because of that, from what I've seen of the qualitative study that I ran with the females, it's completely unappealing. And so if you're going to design something where half of the population is just gonna automatically dismiss your experience, like I think, I would just question if that would be the best use of your time.
I will say on the social risk aspect, I think that's going to be the main thing. So for platforms where it has worked, like I used to be an avid WoW player and I still kind of am, like low key, but that whole thing with WoW and that stops bullying and harassment is that like your reputation is tied to your character and you spend so much time grinding all the way up, and then like if you get outcast by saying the wrong thing at the wrong time, that follows you forever and no one wants to party with you, no one wants to do anything. And if you think of virtual reality as a virtual version of reality, you just think what works in real life, same thing. You don't want to, if you're just like an asshole, no one wants to hang out with you, I mean, you could just have like a reputation that's bound to your name, and then you'd be less likely to take social risks by being a terrible person, I hope.
Yeah, what are some of the other ways that people are looking forward to like solving some of these problems, whether they're technological or social? Have you seen instances of applications recently that have come up that you're just like, oh, that kind of solves that problem, but now we have a new problem? Or do you see examples of some applications that are just straight up maybe not addressing things, and they're able to crop up new problems? And do you have ideas for how those things can be solved?
Yeah, I mean, the most obvious one is like reward the behavior that you want and punish the behavior that you don't want. And so I think that the thing is that if you are the owner of the game or you are going to be like working with the community, then decide up front like what is going to be acceptable behavior and then what is not going to be acceptable behavior, and then tell everyone, and then use the community to enforce it for you. And so there's is anyone here a Duke University alum? No? So Duke University, the way that, so very strong like basketball program there, and it's extremely difficult for even students to get tickets. And so the way that students get tickets to like the Final Four, or not even the Final Four, like the NCAA college basketball championships, is they have to sleep outside between November and March. Yes, that is what Duke University makes their students do if they want to get tickets to the basketball tournament. And so it's not just you have to sleep outside, you have to form a camp with 12 people. Your camp must be continuously occupied over that 4-month period. I think you get like Christmas Day off. But basically, your camp must be continuously occupied. There will be random checks. If no one is in your tent at a particular time, like you're completely out, and like everyone on your team, you've let down.
Sounds like an MMO.
Yeah, yes. And it like, I don't, if nobody's here is from Duke, like it snows in the winter. Like what they put their students through is incredibly traumatic. But the students do it because they want those tickets that badly. And so you can see like where I'm going with this and the parallels to any land is that they've focused people on another goal, which is like how do you get the thing that you want and how do you make the experience work? And one of the ways that they've done it is they're requiring a tremendous amount of effort from you. And the thing is that this goes back to, it's called self-perception theory in psychology. We learn a lot about ourselves by observing our own behavior. And so if I camped outside for 4 months for anything, like for basketball tickets, I would assume that I was the biggest basketball fan on the planet. And so like, don't underestimate the power of that. Like even if you get people to take small actions, which could be like reporting other users, or maybe something like Cristiano was talking about, like that whole idea of like your reputation system. Like maybe there's a way for you to build a reputation system. The important thing is to get your users to take actions in a way that they learn, I care about this experience, I'm observing my own behavior, I'm doing things that take effort, and because of that, I assume that I care about this experience, and I care about this community, and I want things to go from there.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about, and this may be a little bit of AR bias in here, but we even in these use cases we're still talking about an isolated experience. So like a game style, that's just a historical holdover that games just take over, or a whole resource, all the resources of the system just so it can run decently. And so it's very modal, and you're very much in this environment in this game. And I think like in the WoW example is a good one. That's a very controlled environment, right? You have a profile that's controlled by that developer, and it's isolated to that experience. Whereas I think probably what's going to happen is these new immersive technologies are going to be consumed a little bit more like the web than they are like you're running individual games off Steam. And I think you'll have these kind of like, you'll go in and out of things, or you have multi-layered experiences. And if you think about how we use the internet now, that's kind of how it works, right? We have these multiple layers that we're kind of constantly exposed to, which is cool, but also hard to attach like a universal identity to. So I would say what you're proposing would be, if anything at a technical level, just as difficult as saying, well, how do we control anyone's reputation on the internet right now? Not saying it's not possible. The other interesting aspect of this is all this hardware is going to come from corporations who all want to own the entire ecosystem. And while you may have a profile on your Rift, You've got a Steam profile for your Vive, and then, I'm going to take a wild guess that you're going to need a dedicated profile for whatever hardware you have, because that's just been the proven model. But I think there is something to looking at how, I guess the point is that there's some interesting lessons we could pluck from both physical, real life interaction and behavior, but also our internet behavior and interaction, because it's kind of a blend of the two. And is there something that we could use that to say, like, even like, I don't know why this popped in my head, but like eBay, like, they put in the rating system really early on, and that was like, man, if you lost any of your, and it's kind of like how we're doing like Uber and Lyft now, and it's like, it's such an intense number that you don't want to jeopardize it at all. I just don't know how you could apply that across the spectrum of experiences and environments that people will be in. So I would say that's just an unanswered problem, and we probably have to look at how has it been handled in real life as well as the internet on that side.
Cool. So I guess we're talking about like how we want to solve these problems, these issues that are coming up with behavior. Do you have any sort of like dream project, or are you hoping that like if funding ever came through, or if I ever found the right team or anything, what are some things that you would be interested in building that kind of solve these maybe currently inherent problems that just come with VR?
That's actually kind of relevant to what I'm doing now with Torch. Thanks, Will. So what inspired me to leave Magic Leap and start Torch was I'd worked in this world for a few years ahead of a lot of people. And while game development, the reason why I got into Magic Leap and got into AR and VR so easily is because, like I said earlier, game development's a natural match, and we have a lot of existing workflows that we can pretty much, any of you guys can start building something in VR, AR pretty easily. And I think that was a great boost for this current generation of hardware, because we were able to show pretty compelling looking stuff and demos pretty quickly because we could lean on top of these workflows. I feel like that has also encumbered the growth of the platforms a little bit, because I'm pretty sure if you ask any normal on the street, do you have a VR device? And they would say, well, no, I don't play games. Whereas to me, I think these are going to be the future of human-computer interaction, and I don't think they should be considered gaming consoles. They're great entertainment devices, but I don't think that should be the only application. So what I was inspired to do, and what we're working on, is to get more people that don't want to become game developers or don't have a game dev background to work in 3D, work with 3D input, work with 3D display. And I think the more we broaden that number of people both creating and participating on these new platforms that don't have the game development background, I think that will unlock a lot of things. And I think a part of it is more people thinking about how do we solve these problems. Because the thing I think about is like my game development career and my life of gaming started before every title was multiplayer enabled with real-time voice chat, right? And so to me, when that really kind of became the standard, I hated it. Like I wouldn't have a headset. I would turn it off and I wouldn't talk. And I think you have a lot of people that have grown up their entire life gaming, where it's like, yeah, I get on and I play with a bunch of real life people and we talk trash through video chat. And then when you get into a VR thing that's supposed to be like this calm, like, let's just be social people, you're still in this mode of, I'm kind of in a game and I can kind of I can do whatever weird thing I want to say or do. And I wonder if that's a part of, some of this early interaction that we're seeing that wouldn't normally be socially acceptable in real life, but it's kind of carried over. So just to summarize, I think we need to just get more people working and thinking in 3D and be more inclusive and more diverse in who's in it. I think that will create solutions.
Yeah, so I completely agree with that. And there's one game that I have in my mind that I really want, which would be like a WoW raid scenario where everybody's real life skills translate into the game. So if you could like forge something, you had a 3D modeler like medium or blocks, and that was embedded in the game, and they could make tools that would help you overcome puzzles. And then the person that's really athletic, like could throw a spear, would like hunt food for your tribe, and you'd be on a quest or something. So like what you were saying earlier, Jessica, about the common enemy kind of thing that binds people together, you're all relying on each other's skills and what they're interested in the virtual world. That kind of thing would be really cool, I think, and I don't think it's inherently like a good ground for harassment. No one would want to do that because you would just be bad at the game.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I would add is that, like, how could you come up with new activities? Like, there's that idea of like throwing a spear, and there's like associations like that we carry that we all carry, like just as part of like how we grew up in our cultures, which is that like men tend to be more athletic or stronger, or they could throw a spear like faster. Like if you look at the Olympic records, like I'm pretty sure like that would bear out. And so how do you introduce an activity that's not throwing a spear, that that people don't have existing associations for, about like for example, sailing. Sailing is a upper class activity, and then NASCAR is a lower class activity. And so how do you come up with new activities inside of this virtual world that people don't have those associations with? So that way we can leave behind some of those like existing biases that we have. And I think that's what I would like, that's the potential of VR that I'm really excited about, is because you do get to like invent brand new things.
Talking about the potential of VR is a good way to end my questions to you. Does anybody else in the audience have questions for our panelists, either just in general or anybody with anybody's specific role?
Thank you all. First, Cristiano, thank you for Star Trek Bridge Cruise, one of the reasons I bought an Oculus Rift.
All me.
Can you see my Star Trek shirt? I'll show it to you later. Anyway, I asked this in the chat as well. For the panelists, you touched on it. Each of you touched on it a little bit. I'd like to get some of your perspectives on what I'll call aha moments in the VR space for delivery. Meaning, we develop web games, maybe PC games, and other mechanisms, mobile. Maybe not so much best practices, but maybe some of your aha moments or surprises that you've encountered in the VR space specifically.
I'll go first. So yeah, I would say most specifically, so I've been doing VR for like a year, and I'm like pretty desensitized to like what's happening in like places like Rec Room in terms of how women are treated. And so it was a real aha moment for me to bring like 13 complete like VR novices into like Rec Room and Alt Space, and then Facebook Spaces, but Facebook Spaces is private. And like they were not desensitized to the harassment, and then just like weird, like not even things like that wouldn't even be elevated to the level of harassment happened. Like there was this one girl who came in who she, like this group of guys invited her to play dodgeball with them, and so she's like, sure, I'll play dodgeball. It turns out like she had no gaming experience, and using the Vive controllers was incredibly difficult for her. And playing dodgeball using the Vive controllers was incredibly difficult for her. And she kept being the first one out of every single dodgeball game. And she kept trying to leave the dodgeball area. And everyone else was just like, no, don't leave, no, don't leave, no, don't leave, no, don't leave. And they were trying so hard to be friendly, but she so did not want to be there because she felt so incompetent. And that to me was like a real aha moment, is that you have these novices coming in. They're people who are trying to, like, she was trying to be nice, and she was trying to be friendly, and she was trying to get along with new people. But like, she did not have the necessary skills to actually play the games. And so what she told me afterwards is she wanted time alone by herself to practice. And that to me was an aha moment. Like this entire social experience has been built, and the first thing she asks for is solo time. And so I think if there's like any takeaway that like you guys could take with you as you're like building your own experiences, it's like show what you're making to like complete novices who, you know, maybe they have no gaming experience and they can't use the controllers well, or just like find different people to show things to, because if you only show it to your inner circle of friends, you won't learn as much.
Got another question?
So that actually kind of goes naturally into my question. I am ever interested in the fragmentation in entertainment. It seems like everyone's on different timelines, and people are more solo in terms of watching TV or playing games, and you're not co-campaigning anymore. You're in your room alone playing through a campaign. And I'm just wondering, in terms of VR, not AR, sorry, but in terms of VR specifically, because you're closed off and because you're in this world alone, obviously there's community aspects to it. But is there any concern or look to how to kind of combat the isolation?
I would say I think if you think about how nascent VR still is, it's kind of impressive how much effort is going into social VR. And so I would say, while, yeah, you are physically usually alone and your field of view is completely isolated, I think there's been an interesting number of experiments relative to the number of people participating in VR about sharing experiences with other people. So not only just like the pure social, so like we could not have this panel without at least mentioning the Wave VR once, which is kind of like this, music, Burning Man rave social experience that people just jump in and out of all the time. And then they have these scheduled events that people participate in. But then there's also even like I think it might have been Big Screen, or it was one of the kind of viewing apps where people actually jump in and watch a 2D standard movie in a virtual movie theater with a bunch of strangers, which is kind of what you do in real life when you go to the movie theater. And people love that. So I think it could be isolating, but I think it's encouraging how compelled people are by sharing. And I think also a part of it's just this whole brand new thing that we're all still processing, and it's kind of fun to be like, holy crap, there's other people in here with me doing this. But I think that's I don't see too many people just playing like 12 hours a day by themselves 7 days a week. You hear fringe stories about it, but I don't think that's the norm from my experience.
I have one more thing to add, which is like around this whole idea of like isolation. I think there's like actually really interesting solutions to this, because what people have told me, and like other people have told me this as well. So people who are new to VR really like to have other people in the exact same room with them, like sitting on the couch with them. And that to me was not really intuitive, because that's not how I do VR. But I think this is just more validation of like getting outside perspectives, because there's just this whole idea. Actually, Corey, I'm going to tell a story about you. So Corey, Corey is like long time, let's just say he's an expert in the area of games. I think that's probably safe to say about one of the founders of PIGSquad. And so Corey told me the story about Resident Evil, and he was playing Resident Evil in VR, and he said that he likes for his wife to sit on the couch with him when he plays that game, because it's just like, it's so immersive, and like he kind of wanted that anchor to the real world. And so I think that there's these other ways that you can, have a social aspect that doesn't have to be, meeting people in a virtual space. And also it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to have hardware requirements. Like there was that game, like, what is it? Stop Talking and Nobody Explodes? Keep Talking and Nobody Explodes. Like that's another, is everybody familiar with that? Yeah, so it's just that whole idea of like one person that has a VR rig and then everyone else is outside of it. So I would say like look for clever solutions like that because I think that's that whole idea of like people love novel things and so like come up with ways to surprise them.
Any other questions?
Sure. So I work for a trade advocacy organization that advocates for the state's media industry, and I've worked often for government or with government agencies before. So I'm primarily curious in sort of the public impact of VR, and so lensing it primarily through an economic, then a psychological and social lens. And so what I'm curious about is you talked about sort of being this nascent stage, so largely in this sense of developing the platform, but eventually get into this process of really informing it once it's sort of really grounded. And so looking at this relationship between sort of a tech and art binary where initially you have programmers and animators, but as that builds out, you have sort of on one side the entire STEM collaborative, science, technology, engineers, and mathematicians, and then arts, including actors, writers, so forth. And so Jessica and Laura, when you were talking about either human behavior or Laura, I saw that production of Sleep No More when they came into the Boston exhibition. And I'm curious about, just as this goes along, what does that relationship look like between sort of a tech and art crowd and sort of the larger constituency they represent as this develops, and what does that mean for larger economic and workforce development trends for not only Portland, but the entire state?
I mean, I think the really short answer to like how is like art and tech going to collide in education and industry, ideally VR and AR will give people new ways of representing information and will affect the way that they learn, process information, and come up with solutions. So if you're really interested, there's a talk by Brett Victor. It's called The Humane Representation of Thought. And he makes this point that like data tables had to be invented, like graphs had to be invented, pie charts had to be invented, like up until the like 17th century, like humans didn't have any of that. But once humans had a new way to organize information, they were able to be like, oh, this is like actually the map of like what cholera looks like and how cholera spread in this neighborhood. And then they realized cholera was a waterborne disease, and they had no idea before then. And so I think, like in my most optimistic moments, you know, there could be a new form of calculus invented, or there could be something else where people were able to, you know, integrate information in different ways. But yeah, that's me on a good day.
Yeah, and I would also add like that the way that a layperson experiences both art and science is not all that different. There's like a joy of discovery to it. There's like an engagement that goes along with learning. And I think that that applies really broadly to kind of interacting with any of that stuff. So there should be like a natural meeting between, I don't necessarily believe that it's a super binary. So.
As far as how it affects Portland, I'm just gonna go on the record, donuts. Like, new donuts. Yeah, right.
Can do one more question, and I saw Lewis over here, or we could go over here. let's do Lewis.
Jessica, you just mentioned education and changing the way we think and learn. And Paul, earlier you mentioned how you think it's important for people outside of the game sphere to be working in VR. I'm particularly interested in seeing the applications of VR to education specifically. So I wanted to ask you guys if you have any thoughts on virtual reality classrooms, virtual reality student-teacher experiences, and other ways it can be leveraged in all forms of education.
So it kind of relates to the previous question, which is what intrigues me so much about this whole new wave is that we're dealing with 3D input and display. We are able to let someone interact with a digital system very intuitively with a 3D input. So that opens up all kinds of interesting interaction opportunities, whether entertainment or otherwise. And then the fact that we have the ability to present in a 3D display that we haven't been able to do before, either stereoscopically, or I'm even talking more broadly, it may not even mean a wearable, it may be like a volumetric monitor, but the ability to see and work with data and technology, I think has the potential, and I think a lot of people believe it has the potential to just completely rewire even our notion of how do we educate people and how do we have even a classroom. And I know that what we're looking at with my current company is we're looking at all the different people that are actually investing in VR, and it is a lot of enterprise and education and healthcare type stuff. Because it opens up so many possibilities that we just really can't even, it's still an early market, right? So we're still trying to figure out the possibilities of what's possible, if that makes sense. Like we don't even know, we need time to experiment and iterate and explore to really speak concretely about these things work and these things don't. And that's what excites me about Jessica being so like immersed and excited about this, is because I think we need more people like her that can tell us the things that we're doing are on the right track, or like we just, and that's what I mean by just more and more people thinking in 3D and working in 3D. But education's a huge part of it.
I would just recommend a podcast. It's called New School VR, and I think it's out of Portland. Like it's Pinky Gonzalez's. Is that what it's called? Oh, wait, you were interviewed on that. Oh, okay. It's a New School VR. Yep. Is that it? Yeah. And if you just want like a deep dive, like he interviews like 100 people who are like in that space. So I would recommend that.
Something to add real quick. I think it's really powerful in that you can actually bind emotion to learned experiences, and that's a better way to seal in memories. Especially with things like if you're learning history and you want to put someone in the virtual battlefield of a certain time period that's really emotionally, heavy, it could really reinforce the point of having the bad parts of history not repeat themselves in the way that you can't get from reading a textbook. And it like puts you there and makes it real and sticks in your mind a lot easier. Same with abstract concepts like math, like showing like exponential growth. Like you can see it on the paper, but visualizing all these things spawning at that rate, or just as an example, it's super powerful. Also, the excitement of putting on the VR headset and like having the excitement work with the knowledge that you're gaining. Like there's just so many variables and positively affecting that.
Awesome. Well, that is our panel on human behavior in VR. I'd like to give everybody a round of applause, please.